This month has been absolutely packed with travel and challenging freelance deadlines. But all the same, we were determined to get a My Life in Gaming episode released by the end of it. And it would have been a whole lot harder to get it all done without Factor, our sponsor for this video. I love to eat, but sometimes it's gotta be real quick so I can get back to doing what I gotta get back to doing. But still, I want it to be, good. And Factor's got that covered with my weekly deliveries, which I do subscribe to with my own danged money, by the way, because it helps keep me on the right track, eating quality, properly portioned food. Head to Factor75.com or click the link below and use code MLiG50 to get 50% off your first Factor box and 20% off your next month of orders. That's code MLiG50 at Factor75.com to get 50% off your first box plus 20% off your next month of orders. Well, would you just look at this? My Life in Gaming said in an episode only a few months ago that they'd like to do more videos about multi-game collections since they just barely scratched the surface of what they had available to showcase when they took their first stab at it. Is this the quickest turnaround we've ever had on promising to do more of a subject and actually following through? Maybe so, maybe not, but either way, let's get straight to it.
As we said last time, there's no way that we could possibly cover the entire breadth of multi-game compilations in one episode, or even two in this case. Seriously, our list of releases that we wanted to eventually look at in these episodes were several Google Doc pages long. But anyways, right off the rip, I've decided to spend a nice chunk of time looking at some HD collections from a couple of generations back, specifically on the PlayStation 3, because thanks to the increased storage space of a Blu-ray disc, the system really saw a nice group of series compilations. Sure, not all of them were the best, I say as your mind immediately jumps to the Silent Hill HD collection.
What a nightmare.
But I'm willing to bet that there's several good and even great ones that you've forgotten even existed.
The gods of Olympus have abandoned me.
If I remember correctly, the God of War HD collection was Sony's guinea pig for the whole HD collection business. This collection was handled by Bluepoint Games and supervised by Santa Monica Studio. Bluepoint really came out swinging here, determined to make a name for themselves. Clearly, that effort was worth it, cementing them as the best in the business at this sort of thing. You'll definitely see their name come up again. This collection features both God of War 1 and God of War 2 on one disc, with all that additional behind-the-scenes footage that was on the God of War 2 bonus DVD, which is actually a serious amount of behind-the-scenes content. Of course, both games were showpieces for the PlayStation 2 and benefit from being rendered internally at 720p on the PlayStation 3. Yes, it certainly helps that both games featured widescreen and 480p progressive modes originally, but they both had occasional screen tearing here and there. That certainly isn't the case with the HD collection, and I think this is a great way to play both games. Heck, it's how I played both of them during the lead up to God of War 3's release. In 2011, the two PlayStation Portable God of War games, Chains of Olympus and Ghost of Sparta, were brought to the PlayStation 3 in the God of War Origins collection. In a rare case of the original developer handling the remaster, this collection was done by Ready at Dawn, who also did those original games. Being on the PSP originally likely played some part in them being able to render these games at 1080p, and they look fantastic. Surround sound is also on the table for those that can take advantage. Combine these two aspects, pepper in some enhanced controls, such as being able to use the right analog stick to dodge, like in previous entries, and I'd say that this is likely the de facto way of playing the portable God of War games in particular. I have to say, I think that Chains of Olympus might be my favorite of the original style God of War games, topping off at around 5 or 6 hours. It might be the only game in the series that I've played where I didn't get bored by the end. I skipped over the Ratchet & Clank games during the PS2 generation, so I didn't give the release of Tools of Destruction and subsequently A Crack in Time much thought. Then I tried a demo of the latter, and I was in love. After plowing through both of those, and the bridging game Quest for Booty, I needed more. Luckily, the Ratchet & Clank collection wasn't too far behind. Developed by Idle Minds, who hadn't seemed to have done much of note before taking on this project, this disc contains the first Ratchet & Clank, Going Commando, and Up Your Arsenal, presented in 1080p at 60 FPS. The PlayStation 2 versions had a 480p option and ran at 60 FPS as well, so it's not too big of a jump, I guess. Occasional graphical glitches aside, I thought it was a great way to experience these games for the first time as I plowed through them in a couple of weeks when it was released. The first game has been since remade on the PlayStation 4 with all the modern trimmings that 20 years of improvements allowed for, but that makes revisiting the original all the more interesting, if for no other reason than Surfer Dude Ratchet's voice.
I'll just call you Clank for short. Hang on!
The jump in quality from 1 to Going Commando is enormous, and for the longest time, it might have been my favorite entry in this series. It's too bad that Ratchet Deadlock couldn't make it on the disc, but at least it was released as a standalone on PSN. Handled by the now defunct Mass Media Games, the Jak and Daxter collection features Jak and Daxter: The Precursor Legacy, Jak 2, and Jak 3 on disc. Regrettably, Jak X Racing isn't included, as it should have been. You know, I've always assumed that these games would have been tough to port or emulate due to the technique used to stream data from the disc, but this runs at 720p at what seems to be a generally reliable 60 FPS. When the Jak trilogy was released piecemeal on the PlayStation 4 in 2017, instead of using the PS3 version as a basis, Naughty Dog instead decided to run the PS2 version instead of Sony's PlayStation 2 emulator used for PS2 classics. Based on both my experience and the experience of others, this seems to have been a bad decision, as it looks, sounds, and runs worse in almost every regard. It was checking out those standalone releases that revealed to me a feature that many of these HD collections had that I'd simply taken for granted until now: the option to reverse the camera controls. The original PS2 versions of these games used an inverted camera control. That forced option carries over to the PS4, while the PS3 collection lets you choose reversing that on both axes. I guess that decides on what version I'm playing whenever I get around to playing the second and third games. Bluepoint Games returns to deliver the absolute gift that is the Ico and Shadow of Colossus collection. The name says it all. Man, what a treat. The bump to HD doesn't hurt either of these games in the least bit. It is absolutely crazy to me that Ico was a 240p game on the PS2, yet retains so much detail here. Colossus chugged on the PS2 at times, and runs at a mostly consistent 30 FPS though, as long as your PS3 is set to 720p. Although it may have been able to do a higher frame rate, I recall seeing a forum post somewhere that mentioned that the original developers wanted to keep the frame rate to 30 to preserve the cinematic experience of the games. Or maybe it was the game logic was tied to the frame rate, I don't remember, but I think that this was intentional. While I haven't had a chance to play Bluepoint's complete Shadow of the Colossus remake, I can imagine that this collection is the perfect companion for it. The Sly Collection compiles all three of Sucker Punch's Sly Cooper games, Thievius Raccoonus, Band of Thieves, and Honor Among Thieves onto one disc. Like the others, these games run at a nice 720p 60, and the pseudo cel-shaded look carries over perfectly. The visual flaws are easier to track here, especially how the letterboxing doesn't reach the edge of the screen during cutscenes. Clearly, this is just a visual flaw of assets not being designed to accommodate for a 16:9 image, but it's so obvious that I can't believe there wasn't an attempt to fix it. Still, it's not a deal breaker or anything. Checking this out brings up an interesting situation. The first Sly Cooper was just re-released on the PlayStation 4 and 5 using Sony's new PS2 emulator. But visually, it doesn't even come close to how nice the PS3 version is. In some cases, I would even say that this might look worse than the old emulator. At the very least, we do have the option to remap the controls so you won't be stuck with an inverted camera. If you have the means, I'd personally stick with the PlayStation 3 disc. Looking back, I never quite appreciated just how cool it was for Sony to do these compilations of some of their most beloved games on the PlayStation 2 for the PS3. I missed a lot of these during their initial releases, and it was great to get caught up in this way. I also think that it's great that they're generally treated with respect to the originals, even if they weren't perfect. The same couldn't always be said for third-party HD collections, such as, oh, you guessed it, the poster child for HD collections gone wrong. The Silent Hill HD collection is still the butt of many jokes. I mean, just look at that use of Comic Sans. It will never not be funny. This collection is composed of Silent Hill 2 and 3, two games which likely stand at the top of many's best games of all time list, but there is a laundry list of technical issues here that crush the original experience into a fine powder. There's an infographic online that breaks down every issue with it better than I could ever hope to. It's real messy. But, you know, the original games did do a lot of crazy things with this tech that I can't imagine porting these games would have been easy for even a team like Bluepoint Games. Speaking of Bluepoint, they did an absolutely legendary job with the Metal Gear Solid HD collection. They seriously set a standard so high that when faced with the prospect of bringing MGS2 and 3 to current consoles, Konami just decided to port the Bluepoint versions instead of starting from scratch. I mean, I don't blame them, but I think things started to break down when porting a port. The new collection doesn't include Peace Walker anyway, but that might not be seen as much of a loss. Still, I'd personally rather play it on the PlayStation 3 because you get the pressure-sensitive button functionality that the PS2 games had. I also wanted to quickly mention the Metal Gear Solid Legacy Collection. This 2-disc set includes the aforementioned HD collection, but also Metal Gear Solid 4 Guns of the Patriots. No biggie, common game on the system, right? Well, the disc here includes the 2.0 patched version of the game, an update which added trophies, but also the ability to do a full install of the game data, instead of doing it chapter by chapter. It's just nice to have this on disc. Oh, and MGS1 and VR missions are included in this package, but they're just download codes for the PS1 Classic versions. It would have been great to have those on disc, but I don't know, you can't win them all. We were less fortunate with the Zone of the Enders HD collection, which chronicles the first and second games. Fittingly, the PS3 version includes a demo for Metal Gear Revengeance. High Voltage Software takes the reins this time around, and they fare fine with the first game. It's not perfect, but it's totally playable. It's the second game where things really fall apart. Now sure, the PS2 version is a chaotic work of art, but it still held things together pretty well. The HD version's frame rate is stuttery even with indoor environments. I can't imagine what the latter outside areas are like. This version was such a mess that Konami brought in Hexadrive to make things right on the PS3 with a 0.5 GB patch. I appreciate the effort and going the extra mile. But these days, the PlayStation 4 Mars version is probably the best way to play the second runner. It's important to note that the 3 collections mentioned are not exclusive to the PlayStation 3. They were also released on the Xbox 360, and the physical discs are backwards compatible with both the Xbox One and Xbox Series consoles. However, I only have Zone of the Enders in my possession, so I can't personally attest to the differences between the versions of the other games. Prince of Persia 3D trilogy should have been a sure thing. After all, The Sands of Time, Warrior Within, and The Two Thrones was a beloved trilogy, one that shone so brightly that it convinced Disney to make a summer blockbuster out of them. Unfortunately, like that film, this collection is pretty messy. But you know what? It ain't unplayable. Personally, I've only played the first game to completion, so I can't really attest to the others, but word is that all 3 games are missing graphical flourishes and have borked sound mixes, among other aspects. Tales of Symphonia Chronicles takes a big hit frame rate-wise from the GameCube original, going from 60 to 30. At least you get an entire second game to make up for it. The previously Wii exclusive Tales of Symphonia Dawn of the New World. That is a whole lot more than what Tales of Symphonia remastered on current consoles got. Absolutely nothing. That said, the frame rate stuff is still a major bummer. It's not like these systems didn't have the power to handle it, but honestly, I only spent a few hours with the Cube version 20 years ago, so it didn't feel all that jarring to me. Still, it being at 60 FPS would have probably made this the best version of the game.
You picked the wrong guy to mess with.
Last time, I mentioned that as the most iconic NES pack-in, Super Mario Bros. Duck Hunt was the first video game cartridge I ever owned. And when I finally got a Super Nintendo a bit late, Christmas '94, that system too came with a multi-game cartridge that also includes Super Mario Bros. As one of the most famous compilations of all time, Super Mario All-Stars, or Super Mario Collection in Japan, certainly needs no introduction. These spruced up visual remakes single-handedly resulted in me feeling like I'd be alright with selling my NES, a mistake I corrected a few years later. Today, the mushy brick-breaking mechanics in Mario 1 and the Lost Levels can be corrected to match the original 8-bit feel with the Brick Fix fan patch. Aside from that quirk, I love the look and feel of these versions, especially Mario 2 and 3. Speedrunners may be able to identify more nuanced differences between versions, but for my purposes, I consider Mario 2 and 3 NES and SNES to be effectively equivalent in terms of gameplay. So my choice in which version I play just boils down to whether I'm more in the mood for 8-bit or 16-bit graphics and sound. My Super Nintendo came packaged with Super Mario All-Stars and Super Mario World as separate cartridges. But shortly after that, Nintendo did release Super Mario All-Stars plus Super Mario World combined into a single cart with a revamped title screen. Super Mario World is modified in a few minor ways from the standalone ROM. File selection occurs from the Game Select screen, where there are 4 slots instead of 3. And it is possible to back out to the main menu by hitting the Select button on the world map. The most notable change, though, is that Luigi's sprite and animations are no longer a simple Mario palette swap, reflecting his proportions and personality more accurately. Luigi only appears in a 2-player game as per usual, but thanks to the life trading system, it's easy to just kill off Mario and enjoy a single-player game as this unique version of Luigi. A rather disappointing variant of the non-world edition of Super Mario All-Stars came to the Wii during the Super Mario 25th anniversary celebration as a physical game, where it was unavailable on the Virtual Console. There is nothing special at all about this emulated SNES ROM on a disc, which doesn't even offer a 240p output mode, as most certainly would have been done with a proper Virtual Console release. I do think that Super Mario 3D All-Stars is better than it's given credit for being. Its presentation of Super Mario 64, Sunshine, and Galaxy are solid enough on their own merits, but circumstances ranging from the inexplicable limited-time digital availability, the existence of the impressive decompilation ports of Super Mario 64, and expectations that it should have been easy enough to bump Super Mario Sunshine from 30 frames per second to 60 poisoned the reception. Regardless of what may be possible with these games on PC and other platforms, and regardless of my own preference for playing Mario 64 on original hardware, this is by far the best official re-release of Super Mario 64, although I don't have access to the Switch Online expansion pass stuff, which came later. As opposed to prior Virtual Console versions though, it has a decent enough translation of the game's broad range of movement to modern analog sticks, and Switch Online N64 controller support was even added in a patch. I also think that the Joy-Cons work quite well as pointers for Super Mario Galaxy, which looks and runs beautifully here. Sure, if they'd have gone further, 3D All-Stars could have been really special, but it's by no means bad, and they did at least do a tad more than the bare minimum by implementing high-res HUD elements. It can be easily recommended as a great way to play any of the included games. Well, it would be, if you could easily buy it at least.
Look out! It's long! I know!
When I was in Germany earlier this year, I came across a few Xbox 360 compilations that I hadn't seen before. Although, as it turns out, this Tomb Raider collection with Legends, Anniversary, and Underworld was actually released in North America, but I'd had my eye out for a 360 copy of Tomb Raider Anniversary for a long time, and I'd like to give all of these games an honest go anyway, so I was happy enough to buy it, even though I guess I could have gotten it back home had I known to be on the lookout for it. Each game is on its own disc, and every single one is supported on Xbox backwards compatibility, so that was a nice bonus too. All of my footage here was recorded via Xbox Series X, which does improve the frame rate situation in these a fair bit, although they admittedly still feel a bit unpolished in many areas. Look at the weird line that's always on the left side of the screen in Anniversary. It's there on a real 360 too. Ah well, I suppose I can crop it out when I sit down to play it for real. Coury has the North American PS3 version, which instead has all 3 games on one disc. Something that I can find no evidence of ever having been released outside of Europe, though, is this collection of otherwise digital-only Ubisoft games for Xbox 360. Yet again, I was shocked to see these install on my Series X, each one individually. Perhaps this set is less compelling now that the Beyond Good and Evil 20th Anniversary Edition was announced and released shortly after I bought it, but Outland and From Dust seem pretty interesting too, so I'm looking forward to checking them out more. For those who don't know, From Dust is by Eric Chahi, the creator of the much beloved Another World, aka Out of This World. Outland in particular seems right up my alley. It's from Housemarque of Resogun, Nex Machina, and Returnal fame, and applies their signature bullets and particles design to a side-scrolling platformer. I also can't find any evidence of a PS3 release of this collection, European or otherwise, so this is quite a nice thing to grab for the 360. One European exclusive Xbox 360 physical that I'd imported several years ago though is the Monkey Island Special Edition collection. I've always been so impressed by how perfect the voice acting is in these, considering these lines were never intended to be read out when originally written.
I guess I could hike all the way over there. Once! Be right back. And don't touch anything!
I have to admit though, the special edition artwork doesn't hold up to my memories of it. I loved the look back in the day when I played these as downloads on PS3, but this was a time when people were still figuring out how to do high-res 2D game art. The second game does look a fair bit better overall, I'd say, and you can switch to the original graphics at any time in both games. There's also a European PS3 version, but considering the 360 version is backwards compatible, I'd say that makes this disc a bit more versatile.
It's kind of a long story.
Oh, that's okay. I've got time.
Well...
Several years back, we did a documentary on Japanese game developer M2, who were most famous for well-done ports of older games to newer hardware. Since the release of that documentary, they've built upon their legacy with ShotTriggers, a series of releases that focus on one or more shooters, or shmups, by giving you not only faithfully realized arcade ports, but just about every port of said games to consoles. Toaplan Arcade Garage has been the most consistent multi-game series under the ShotTriggers brand name, and have landed on the Nintendo Switch and the PlayStation 4 thus far. Kyokyoku Tiger Heli was the first entry in the series, collecting the vertically scrolling chopper shooters Tiger Heli and Twin Cobra arcade games, along with the various console versions of each. Get Star, a bizarre belt scroller type of game, was included as a bonus. The Japanese version hit in 2021, with the game complete on cart on the Switch, but the PS4 version only had the arcade games on disc, with the rest being added via patch. Ugh. Next came Hisho Same 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 in 2022. The English names you might recognize here are Flying Shark and Fire Shark, two intense vertically scrolling biplane shooters. And Wardner, a kooky platformer that I don't quite get. Again, the various console editions are along for the ride. The most recent release is Zero Fire, and for the first time in the entire ShotTriggers series, we have a pair of horizontal shooters, Heckfire and Zero Wing. The answer to the most pressing question is that yes, the European Mega Drive version of Zero Wing is here. Toaplan is more known for their vertical shooters. They show here that they have the goods to make horizontal shooters as well. Demon World is a quirky run and gun included as a bonus game. Each copy of the Toaplan Garage games include a code for a silly falling puzzle game, Teki Paki, which is a pleasant little time. Up until recently, the Toaplan Arcade Garage games have been Japan exclusive, but with Tiger Heli getting localized and dropped a couple of months back, I'm hoping the rest will eventually arrive. These are so good that it would be a real travesty not to bring them to everyone. Plus, the PS4 physical version from Limited Run has all the games on disc, even Teki Paki. Each compilation is absolutely bonkers loaded with options. There's game modes, scaling options, lag options, game modifiers, challenge modes, archival materials, and gadgets. These are various, gadgets or utilities that line the area around the game screen to give you way more information than you could possibly ever utilize effectively. Maps, power-up levels, and even soundtrack info. I can appreciate that these make good use of the available screen space, but they might not be for everybody. The real hook though, the super easy modes for the arcade renditions. These modify specific aspects of a game to make it feel more modern and beginner-friendly. That's what I like about M2. They're huge fans of the games that they're porting, and they just can't help themselves from going above and beyond. This is most apparent with their Aleste collection, which compiles Master System, MSX, and Game Gear vertical shooter series. Sorry, no Musha Aleste in this package, which is kind of a bummer, but what are you gonna do? In fact, it does seem a bit bare bones overall compared to the others. I'm willing to forgive them though, seeing as they made a whole hunkin' entire new game, GG Aleste 3, and it absolutely rules. I love that it was designed within the constraints of the real Game Gear hardware. It's the star of the show here, but the other games are pretty great too. You know, I had no idea that the music in these games rocks so much. The ShotTriggers releases are true works of passion by the devs at M2. However, they've been behind a lot of other shooter collections that run on the same tech, but they aren't featured under that banner. The Darius Cosmic Collection spanned 3 separate releases and chronicle just about every game released in the Darius series. You know, the one where you shoot giant robotic fish. Released on the Switch and PS4, there's a staggering amount of content across these releases. The arcade collection has, obviously, the arcade versions of Darius, Sagaya, and Darius Gaiden included. The first 2 games were unconventional in that they used a multi-monitor setup, making the game ultra-wide. This requires a unique approach in porting the games, and the results are interesting. I don't know how else they could have done this, so it's an adequate solution for a unique problem. But depending on the size of your screen, or in Switch handheld mode, everything might be incredibly tiny. The console collection is significantly more stuffed, with various home versions of Darius 2, Sagaya, Darius Twin, Darius Force, Supernova, Darius Alpha, and Darius Plus. Whew! It's not everything though, like it's missing the Saturn version of Darius Gaiden, and probably plenty of other stuff that I don't even know existed. The third collection, Cosmic Revelation, is a bit different. It has 3 separate games with no uniting interface. Each appears as its own icon on the Switch dashboard. Darius Burst EX plus Another Chronicle is another iteration on the Darius Burst games. I'm not sure what makes this one different from Chronicle Saviors, as I haven't played it all that much. G-Darius HD is a remaster of the fully polygonal entry that came out in the arcades and on the PlayStation 1. Finally, if you bought the physical copy from Strictly Limited Games, then you get the Game Boy version of Sagaya. It's just a Game Boy version of Sagaya. A neat little bonus that feels out of place on this cart in particular, but what am I going to do, tell them not to add anything else? The options in these collections are very close to what the ShotTriggers all offer: gadgets, scaling options, and so on. These are every bit a part of the brand, despite not being officially recognized. The only thing missing here is the inclusion of a super easy mode. During the production of this episode, and after nearly 2 years of waiting, I received my physical copy of Ray's Arcade Chronology from Strictly Limited Games. Perfect timing to be able to include it here, and almost makes it worth the wait. Taito's Ray games are vertically scrolling polygonal arcade shooters. The series consists of 3 games: Ray Force, Ray Storm, and Ray Crisis, where you use a combination of good old shooter, ducking, and weaving, along with lock-on lasers. If the latter 2 names sounded familiar, you might recognize Ray Force under the name Galactic Attack or Layer Section. Ray's is a bit lighter on content versus everything that I've mentioned up till now, but the HD remasters of Storm and Crisis go a long way in taking the collection to another level. They look really nice, although in my opinion, both are a step down from Ray Force, which mixed polygons with sprites to great effect. Even though these are the arcade games only, no home ports included, there is an option to use the CD audio soundtracks from those versions. I'm annoyed that there's no way to get a completely black border, but at least it has ShotTriggers window dressing in the form of gadgets. You know, I wonder what sort of thought goes into rationalizing between having an optional black border or one where off means a gray gradient, aka not off. I'm not going to stop there with the shooting action. Just because it's not handled by M2 doesn't mean that it's not worth looking at, right? Before I get out of here, I'm going to take a quick look at a handful of other shooter collections. The duology of Thunder Force Gold collections for the Sega Saturn are Japanese exclusive. There was a time when I sought out both collections, which had gotten a bit pricey. The first one has Thunder Force 2 MD and Thunder Force 3 on it, while the second one has Thunder Force AC, an arcade version of 3, and Thunder Force 4, or Lightning Force if you prefer. Outside of CG intros, both collections are fairly light on content, although the console games might not slow down quite as much thanks to the more powerful hardware. Hey Sega, can we get a Thunder Force Complete collection already? I am sure that M2 would be happy to make that happen, and I'd be happy to buy it. Raiden Project is a launch-era PS1 disc that has the arcade versions of the first and second games on board, complete with adjustable difficulties and remixed soundtrack options. I'd never spent much time with this series, the first two especially, and I was struck by how gorgeous they truly are. The second game in particular has great sprite work and animation. The US version has a bugged tape mode apparently, so if you want the complete experience, opt for the Japanese version instead. Lastly, I wanted to touch on the Telenet Shooter Collection from IDEA, which collects a couple of PC Engine CD-ROM shooters and a couple of Sega Mega Drive shooters onto one Switch cart. Granada and Gyarus are beloved and expensive Mega Drive games. It won't be much of a surprise that the PC Engine games Avenger and Psychic Storm are Japanese only, and aren't formally translated in the typical way. You just get English text superimposed on the screen. As someone who hadn't played either till now, they sure have that signature Telenet sparkly jank, as I like to call it. Great looking, sounding, and playing, but there's an underlying cheapness to them that makes them seem like they were rushed out the door, which is sort of how this entire package feels. Each game gives the illusion that there's a lot of options to tweak games to your liking, but really, most of it is just fluff. Really, an icon that says special support, and when you click on it, it just says, "Thank you for your support," really big on screen. At least you can listen to the music and watch cutscenes. Selecting and starting a game lets you access another menu to make adjustments to the screen size. Unfortunately, there will be shimmer. Oh yes, there will be shimmer. Still, if you want to own a version of any of these games, this collection is a heck of a lot cheaper than any single one of these games on the used market.
Telenet's catalog is now owned by a company called IDEA, and as with the Telenet Shooter Collection, IDEA seems to be focused only on the Switch at the moment for their retro revivals. They aren't even putting these on Steam. And another example of IDEA's releases in this space are a group of collections revolving around the storied Valis series. Digitally, these collections are weirdly expensive for what they offer. In fact, it's a rare example of the limited run physical copies being less expensive than the Switch eShop. Really though, all you need are the PC Engine / TurboGrafx versions of 1, 2, 3, and 4, which are nearly universally considered the best, by a long shot. The first collection is nothing but good games, the PC Engine versions of 1, 2, and 3. But the pre-existing English releases of 2 and 3 from back in the day are not present as far as I can tell.
メガスとなぜ戦う？メガスとは何者だ？
お前には無縁のことだ。剣を置いてリアリティの世界に去れ。
As with the Telenet Shooter Collection, English text is juxtaposed over the Japanese versions. I'm not sure if this is a licensing issue or what, but elsewhere across these collections, even the cartridge-based games that were released in English back in the day are also the Japanese versions. The second collection only has one particularly good game, Valis 4 for the PC Engine. All of these are also listed individually on the eShop for $15 a pop, so you could just grab 4 by itself that way. The Mega Drive version of 3 and Super Valis 4 are also good enough to consider as individual purchases independent of the $55 third collection. Scrolling shimmer often detracts from the visuals in many of the various entries. The only thing that feels at all above and beyond are the scanned and translated manuals. That is nice. The games play fine, well, the good ones play fine, but every angle of this presentation screams low budget. That, combined with the padding of these collections with really terrible computer, Famicom, and Mega Drive versions to justify a high price, makes these releases feel cynical and insulting. But then again, especially in the case of platforms that people are less likely to emulate, like MSX and PC-88, I can't deny that it's great for all of these versions to be available for the sake of presenting the near-complete history of Valis, the premier B-tier action platforming series. I absolutely think that all collections should strive to do this, provide the good and bad versions alike. But in this case, my feeling is that it wasn't done for the right reasons. If you're into importing new release titles, then a trend you're probably already aware of is that there's an extremely high chance of Nintendo Switch games from Japan or Asia regions including the English version on the game card. It's something that you can count on in a way that's a bit more hit or miss with, say, PlayStation imports. Typically, these will even bring up the localized titles and artwork on the Switch Dash, like with the Gyakuten Saiban 1, 2, 3, and 4, 5, 6 game cards becoming the Ace Attorney trilogies when inserted into an English language Switch system. I mentioned both of those in the previous episode, so let's take a look at a few more Switch import collections. Etrian Odyssey 1, 2, and 3 HD can be bought as a bundle called the Etrian Odyssey Origins Collection on the Switch eShop or on Steam, but all 3 games were also released on a Switch game card in Japan and Asia. I've got the Asian edition here because I'm unclear if the Japanese release also includes English. While certainly not cheap, the current pricing of the physical copy is less than the digital bundles. I played one stratum of the first Etrian Odyssey on DS back in the day, and I felt I'd had enough. But I really do admire the no-nonsense, pure dungeon crawlery, character-building spirit of this series, and have been wanting to give it another go. Perhaps the auto map feature will help make it more approachable to me and others, since it can draw not just floors, but also walls if you set it to full auto mapping. The HD version presentation is simple, but it works well enough and is consistent across the 3 games. They do admittedly look best on the Switch screen itself though, and the ability to work on the map via touch controls does seem nicer than using only the controller for it. I hear that the Steam version also lets you do mapping stuff with a mouse, which sounds pretty good too. Oniken and Odalis are a pair of retro-style action games from the esteemed Joy Masher prior to the development of their more well-known Blazing Chrome and Vengeful Guardian Moonrider. As far as I know, PlayAsia was the exclusive distributor of the physical copies of these in a combo pack. Oniken is very much a Ninja Gaiden style game, and it is hard as heck. I tend to be pretty steadfast in my determination to finish games like this, but I never got around to game past the second to last stage. Maybe someday. Odalis has a bit more exploring and adventuring going on. I really like what I've played, but I've not really sat down and committed to it just yet. Both games do have presentation issues on Switch, with Oniken being really blurry and Odalis being slightly unevenly scaled, but with minimal noticeable shimmer. A digital collection is available and saves you a tiny bit off the price of the 2 games as sold individually. The Baten Kaitos 1 and 2 HD Remaster combines a contender for my favorite GameCube RPG, the first game, with one that I didn't take to nearly so well, the second game known as Baten Kaitos Origins outside Japan. North America did not get a physical copy of the HD remasters, but Europe, Japan, and Asia regions did. This is the Asia version. There seems to be confusion out there as to whether a download is required. With the Asian copy at least, it won't let you start without a download if you're online. But if you're offline, it insists that you should update, but lets you start anyway. Both games boot without the update, but I'm not sure if there could be issues later. I'll keep this brief as I haven't played much of the remasters yet. I don't hate what they did with the upscales quite as much as what Square Enix did with Chrono Cross, which Baten Kaitos looks quite a bit like itself, but that doesn't mean I like it. It's pretty smudgy overall. In addition, while the games now target 60 frames per second, scrolling and fade to black transitions often look very jittery in areas where the GameCube original, despite its 30 FPS target, has no problem remaining consistent. That said, I do want to give the second game a second chance, and this is the more affordable copy to own than the GameCube version, which I definitely regret selling. I just didn't like the changes that Origins made to the battle system at all, but maybe it'll click for me next time.
Yeah! Yeah!
全然手応えなかったよ。
Here's a quirky one. I imported Kunio-kun, the World Classics collection, before the Double Dragon and Kunio-kun Retro Brawler bundle was announced and released digitally a little over a year later, which I now also have a physical copy of. They are basically the same product, but different. What's interesting is that Kunio-kun, the World Classics collection, does have a unique and translated art tile on the Switch dashboard, in addition to the localized logo being used on the title screen alongside English menus, despite this not being a title that has existed in Western markets. The collection is jam-packed with Kunio and Double Dragon games from the Famicom and NES. So you can play Downtown Neketsu Monogatari as it originally was on Famicom if you like, or play the more familiar NES version, River City Ransom. Each is in its original language, Japanese and English respectively, so there are no new translations here. However, the Double Dragon and Kunio-kun Retro Brawler bundle, which has its own logo on the title screen, does have translated versions of the Japanese games, including box art with English logos photoshopped in. So you can play River City Ransom as always with the American-styled Alex and Ryan, or the original Kunio and Ricky, but this time in English. I'm especially looking forward to playing through Downtown Neketsu Special, Kunio-kun's historical period drama, which is basically an old-timey Japan version of River City Ransom. There's a not super descriptive quality up version you can play of various games that supposedly fixes some glitches and rebalances things. In Double Dragon, quality up fixes the glitch where you can climb up the wall and loop back up from the bottom in stage 1, but the infinite points glitch in stage 2 remains. You can change and disable borders per game, add simple but decent scan lines, and actually play in 4:3 with interpolated scaling for no scrolling shimmer, making this an enthusiastically try-approved retro collection. But just remember that the version with the new translations does not load up when using the Japanese physical. Now, something that you should count on not having English on the game card are import versions of Nintendo published games. The Famicom Detective Club collection that includes the HD remakes of the 2 original Famicom Disk System adventure games is an unfortunate example of this. It got a really elaborate physical copy in Japan, and only Japan, with soundtrack CDs for both games and some really nice prints. Maybe, if we're lucky, the just-released all-new Famicom Detective Club game, Emio the Smiling Man, which weirdly enough did get a retail physical copy in Western markets on day 1, could lead to localized physical copies of the first 2 games in other regions as well.
So that's about it for this latest batch of multi-game compilations. We've made a decent dent in our list of these sorts of releases, but we still definitely have a ways to go. If we didn't look at your favorite compilations this go around, trust me, it'll probably eventually show up in a future installment. But that's not to say that you can't recommend us some of your favorites. I am starting to feel like this might be a bottomless well, considering that more collections than ever are being regularly announced and released. So what's a whole bunch more to throw on the pile, right?